He was dragged out of his seat, eyes calm, back straight, while the woman who bribed a flight attendant to steal his spot sipped champagne in first class, and no one lifted a finger to stop it. But just minutes later, the very crew that tried to push him out would be facing consequences no one saw coming. What happened on this flight wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a moment that would shake an entire airline from the inside out. It started with quiet discrimination and ended with a revelation that changed everything. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy real, eye-opening stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Marcus Thorne arrived at the private terminal of Skylux Airlines with the kind of presence that didn't demand attention. It commanded it. Wearing a charcoal suit tailored with surgical precision and carrying a slim leather briefcase in his left hand, Marcus moved with quiet certainty through the marble-floored lobby. The terminal, built for exclusivity, pulsed with the soft hum of business deals, espresso machines, and designer wheels rolling past security. A few glanced at him, some curious, others quick to look away, but he was used to that. It came with the territory, not the territory of wealth, but of being the exception in spaces built to exclude. As he approached gate C3, a soft chime signaled the beginning of first-class boarding. A polished voice called, "First-class passengers may now board through priority lane 1. The agent at the gate was tall, fair-skinned, and poised. Her name tag read Serinda. She greeted each passenger ahead of Marcus with that effortless charm reserved for familiar faces. Firm handshake for the tech CEO, a warm smile for the retired couple in matching Burberry scarves, even a slight bow for the foreign diplomat. But when Marcus stepped forward, boarding pass in hand, Serinda's expression shifted. She didn't meet his eye, didn't offer a welcome aboard, and certainly didn't extend the steaming towel she'd just handed the guest before him. Instead, she looked directly past him, her eyes lighting up as she called out, "Oh, Mrs. Halvorsen, we're so glad to see you again," to the woman 2 people behind him. The scanner chirped softly as it read his pass to A first class, but Serinda didn't acknowledge it. Without a word or even a nod, she motioned him through with a gesture that felt more like dismissal than service. Marcus said nothing. He stepped into the jet bridge and continued forward, his silence deliberate, his awareness acute. This wasn't the first time he'd been overlooked. Not in life, and certainly not in luxury travel. But even the most seasoned man could feel the sting of being unseen on a flight he'd paid 5 figures to board. The cabin greeted him with understated opulence, muted lighting, wide leather seats, chilled glasses of sparkling water, and a low, ambient instrumental track designed to calm the already powerful. He moved toward his seat, to a left-hand window, extra legroom, and placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment with practiced precision. Just as he turned to sit, a sharp jolt struck his right shoulder. The contact, though quick, was firm enough to make him stagger half a step. He looked up, catching the blur of platinum blonde hair and designer heels brushing past him. Karen Delbridge, adorned in a fur-lined coat and oversized sunglasses despite the dim cabin light, clutched her Louis Vuitton tote like a shield and made no effort to apologize. Instead, she turned toward the aisle where Serinda had just entered and exclaimed with feigned surprise, "Oh, I almost knocked someone down. These aisles are so narrow." Her laugh was pointed, not careless. Serinda laughed too, the kind of laugh women share when they've spotted someone out of place. Marcus met neither of their gazes. He calmly adjusted his seat, slid his phone into the leather side pocket, and waited. The flight attendant moved through the cabin again, handing hot towels to passengers seated in rows 1 and 2. He saw her approach 2B, Karen's seat, and lean in with exaggerated warmth as she placed the towel delicately in her manicured hand. But when she reached 2A, she paused for a fraction of a second, then walked past without offering one to Marcus. He glanced slightly toward her retreating figure, but said nothing. Not yet. Karen, seated beside him, sighed dramatically as she dabbed her face with the towel and muttered, "It's so rare these days to get the service we deserve." Marcus leaned back against the headrest, his fingers interlaced over his lap. His posture radiated composure, but his thoughts were already cataloging the sequence of dismissals. First, Serinda's nonverbal erasure at the gate. Then, Karen's intentional shoulder check. Now, the selective towel service. None of it was overt. That was the craft of these encounters. It was discrimination by omission. Power plays made through silence, position, and passive denial. Around them, other passengers were greeted with champagne, pre-flight snack menus, and name-based courtesies. A tall man 2 rows ahead was discussing Bordeaux vintages with a flight attendant. A couple to the right received a personal briefing about meal preferences and special dietary accommodations. Marcus received nothing. No name, no towel, no tray. Only the slow, creeping awareness that the cabin, though dressed in civility, was already drawing its invisible lines. And he, once again, had been placed on the wrong side. The irony was not lost on him. He had built his reputation and his fortune, creating tools for companies to identify implicit bias in their operations. The kind of bias that didn't shout but whispered. The kind that wore a smile while holding a dagger. As the cabin doors closed and the final passengers settled in, Marcus looked ahead, not with defeat, but calculation. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. Passengers adjusted pillows, tapped on tablets, and accepted warm smiles and drinks from the uniformed crew gliding down the aisle. The flight attendant Serinda, with her signature polished poise, moved with practiced efficiency, tray in hand, offering drinks row by row, her movements choreographed like a ballroom waltz. Marcus remained seated, posture composed, gaze forward, but his peripheral vision noted every gesture. As she approached his row, she handed a glass of sparkling water to the passenger across the aisle with a gracious nod, then turned toward Karen in 2B, who requested white wine. Serinda leaned in with a smile, asking whether she preferred French or Californian, then reached into the tray for a small bottle chilled on ice. Karen replied, "French, of course," and smiled knowingly. The glass was poured with care, handed with both hands, accompanied by a napkin embossed with the airline's gold crest. Then Serinda stood upright, turned to Marcus's side, met his eyes for half a second, and pivoted. No offer, no word, no gesture. She stepped forward to the next row, as if his seat didn't exist, as if he were invisible in that moment, as if she hadn't just served the passenger next to him with excessive warmth. Marcus let the silence breathe. He didn't raise a hand, didn't speak. The message had already been delivered, and it wasn't about drinks. It was about presence, or, in his case, the intentional erasure of it. 5 minutes later, Serinda returned up the aisle, this time with a tray of small snack bowls, almonds, crackers, olives, again served with the same delicate routine. This time, Marcus watched more directly, not confrontationally, but with a measured focus. Serinda repeated her ritual, serving Karen again with a chuckle about how some passengers always know what they want, then moved down the aisle without so much as a glance toward Marcus. 2 passes, 2 deliberate omissions, and all without a word. Still, Marcus did not react outwardly. He was long past the phase of needing validation through outrage. He observed. He remembered. He endured with intent. As the cabin finished boarding, a new wave of passengers passed through the aisle. A woman in designer heels juggled a laptop bag and a faux fur neck pillow. A middle-aged man wheezed as he adjusted his oversized duffel overhead. Behind them, a tall, broad-shouldered young man in military dress uniform struggled with his rucksack. Karen rolled her eyes and whispered, "Must be amateur hour back there," as she sipped her wine. Marcus ignored the comment. He rose calmly to assist the uniformed man, helping him lift the rucksack into the bin above row 3. The man nodded his thanks, and Marcus returned to his seat. Then came the next act in the quiet war. As Marcus reached for his own carry-on, which he had placed in the overhead bin directly above his seat just moments before, he found the compartment strangely full. Karen, still seated, now leaned back and casually waved a hand. "Oh, I move your bag. There just wasn't enough room for mine." Her tone was breezy, almost playful. Marcus opened the bin and found her oversized designer tote crammed into the center, her smaller bag balanced on top. His own briefcase had been shifted toward the edge, barely balanced and partially open. He took a breath. "You moved my bag?" he asked, more as confirmation than challenge. "It was in the way," she replied. "I needed the space. First come, first served, right?" Her smile was tight, teeth barely visible. She looked back toward the window, clearly considering the matter closed. Marcus reached in, retrieved his briefcase slowly, checked that nothing inside had shifted, then began scanning for another open compartment. He walked 5 steps forward before Serinda appeared, arms crossed, brows gently raised. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, her tone suddenly alert. Marcus responded evenly. "Not a problem. Just making space." She glanced at the bag in his hand, then passed him toward Karen, who now looked down at her phone. "You'll need to place that farther back. Overhead bins up here are reserved for front row guests," Serinda said. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "I'm into a..." Serinda hesitated. "Even so, those bins fill up quickly." She gestured vaguely toward the back. Without another word, Marcus turned, walked calmly to row 5, and stowed his bag. As he returned, he passed Karen, who now pretended to be absorbed in her emails, and Serinda, who didn't move. Marcus sat, eyes steady ahead. His seat was his. His composure was intact. But the strategy had become clear. He had been systematically diminished through small but intentional acts. And as he returned from placing his carry-on in row 5, the undercurrent of exclusion only grew heavier. The walkway was partially blocked by a tall man in a dark navy vest bearing a Skylux staff insignia, Nestor. He stood just ahead of Marcus's row with his hands clasped in front, perfectly still, his frame solid, his eyes scanning the cabin, but pausing when Marcus approached. Nestor didn't move. He made no attempt to shift or acknowledge Marcus's presence, even though he stood squarely in front of 2A. Marcus stopped an arm's length away and waited. Nestor remained stationary, acting as if he were simply monitoring boarding progress, though boarding had ended. A beat passed, then another. Marcus tilted his head slightly and gave a polite, "Excuse me." Nestor looked directly at him but didn't step aside. Instead, he slowly turned his body just enough to feign movement but not actually allow passage, a performance of courtesy designed to fail. Marcus paused, registering the power play in silence. This wasn't an oversight. This was body language as blockade, authority used as friction. With calm deliberation, Marcus stepped to the side, brushing the seat in front, and slid between the narrow space that Nestor left unguarded. As he moved past, Nestor said nothing, offered no apology, no nod. Just a cold flick of the eyes that followed Marcus until he returned to his row. When Marcus arrived at 2A, another scene awaited him. Karen Delbridge was now fully reclined, her seat tilted back to its lowest limit, feet outstretched into the shared footwell, a silk sleeping mask resting on her forehead, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones secured snugly over her ears. She appeared lost in her curated comfort, unaware, or pretending to be, that Marcus had returned. But the real offense wasn't in her posture. It was in her positioning. Karen was now sitting diagonally, her legs spilling into Marcus's space, one elbow perched squarely on the shared armrest, the other draped loosely into a seat's territory. Marcus paused beside her, waiting for acknowledgement. None came. He cleared his throat gently, still receiving no response. The music from her headphones bled faintly into the cabin air, the dull thump of some ambient playlist matching her detached expression. Without speaking, Marcus gestured slightly toward his seat. Karen didn't flinch. Her eyes remained closed beneath the mask, her body language an unmistakable wall of dismissal. After a long moment, he spoke clearly but not loudly. "Ms. Delbridge, you're in my seat." She didn't respond. Instead, she adjusted her leg, pulling it further into his side of the cabin. Her lips curled subtly, almost imperceptibly, a knowing smirk forming beneath the mask. Marcus looked down at his armrest. Both cup holders were occupied, one by her wine glass and the other by her phone. He stood there, tall and composed, not backing away, but not escalating. The silence between them stretched, charged with the unspoken tension of intent. From behind, Nestor's voice interjected. "Is there a problem, sir?" The tone was sterile, practiced, the question loaded. Marcus turned halfway, his posture controlled. "I'm simply trying to return to my seat." Nestor stepped forward, now conveniently interested in resolving the congestion he had helped cause. Karen pulled off her headphones and lifted the mask slowly, her performance deliberate. "Oh, I didn't even realize you were back," she said, voice dripping in mock surprise. "You left so suddenly. I thought maybe you changed seats." She sipped her wine and casually motioned toward the space beside her. "But of course, go ahead." She didn't move her bags. She didn't straighten her seat. She simply continued sipping, as if the problem was Marcus's presence, not her obstruction. Marcus remained still for one beat, then another. Then calmly and silently, he lifted her phone and wine glass with careful precision, setting them gently onto her tray table. He straightened her footrest manually, retracted it with a button on his side of the console, and eased into 2A without making contact with her body. She watched the entire process, clearly annoyed, but unwilling to react openly. Nestor hovered a moment longer, but Marcus didn't acknowledge him again. The message was clear: he would not be baited. He would not be moved. And most importantly, he would not be erased. As the engines began to hum and the cabin doors sealed with a pneumatic hiss, Marcus buckled his seatbelt, adjusted his wristwatch, and stared ahead, unblinking. He stood briefly, angled into the aisle to access the bin above row 3, and within seconds, Serinda was there. She wasn't holding a tray, nor responding to a call light. She wasn't delivering safety instructions. She simply appeared like a shadow summoned by movement. In her hand was a small sign no larger than a folded napkin, white laminated, with gold lettering that read, "Reserved for VIP." Without saying a word, she stepped into Marcus's row, leaned over his empty seat, and carefully placed a sign on the armrest of 2A, the very seat he had just been occupying. Then she gave him a brief, almost impersonal smile and turned to walk away before he could even ask a question. The message was quiet but thunderous. It didn't matter that he had paid for this seat or that he had boarded first class legitimately. In their eyes, he was now occupying space meant for someone more acceptable. Marcus stared at the sign for a full breath, then calmly sat down, left it where it lay, and reopened his tablet. He would not entertain their theater. But their act wasn't finished. A man seated directly behind Marcus, middle-aged, pale-skinned, round face with a sports jacket far too small for his build, had begun to shift in his seat. At first it was minor, a quick lean forward, an elbow brushing the back of Marcus's chair. Then came the first kick, not strong, but firm, the kind that made the headrest jolt ever so slightly forward. Marcus let it go. The second came 30 seconds later. Another jolt. The third hit just as Marcus was opening his notes app to review a document. This one had weight, enough to push him forward again. He turned halfway, not all the way, just enough to glance back to catch the man's eye. The stranger was sipping club soda and flipping pages of an in-flight magazine as if nothing had happened. No apology, no eye contact, no acknowledgement. Marcus returned to his screen, pressed his back into the chair, and waited. The fourth kick came exactly 30 seconds later. This time, Marcus closed his tablet, placed it on his lap, and slowly turned all the way around. "Is there a reason your knee keeps finding the back of my seat?" he asked, voice low but measured. The man looked up, clearly pretending to register him for the first time. "Sorry," he said without sincerity. "It's tight back here." He gave a quick shrug, then added, "Maybe you're leaning too far back." Marcus didn't smile. "The seat reclines 6 degrees, he replied. "That's regulation." The man shrugged again, less like someone apologizing, and more like someone signaling the end of a conversation he never intended to have. Marcus slowly turned forward. The fifth kick came 90 seconds later, slightly softer, but there. Persistent. Petty. Predictable. Across the aisle, another passenger, a woman in her 30s wearing tortoise-shell glasses, glanced over and gave Marcus a sympathetic look. She'd seen it too. Marcus nodded once in acknowledgement, then returned his attention to the armrest, where the VIP reserved card still sat untouched. He tapped it twice with his index finger, then flipped it over so the gold letters face down. It was a small act, But in a battle of microaggressions, it was enough. Serinda passed by again soon after, now distributing appetizer menus. She stopped beside 2B and offered Karen 2 choices with an exaggerated smile, lingering as they joked about wine pairings. But when she turned to Marcus, her voice dropped half a pitch, and she said, "Sir," without a name, holding the menu out as if it were a receipt. Marcus took it without a word, letting the silence thicken between them. He could feel the eyes again, people watching, guessing, deciding whether this black man in a tailored suit belonged here or had somehow slipped through the system. The pressure wasn't overt. No one shouted. No one cursed. It was the pressure of precision exclusion, of social orchestration played like a violin. As the meal service rolled forward, the lights dimmed slightly, and passengers settled into a quieter rhythm. The clinking of utensils and hushed laughter filled the space, but the subtle choreography of exclusion remained in motion. Nestor, who had been conspicuously absent from the cabin for nearly half an hour, suddenly reappeared near row 2, holding a tablet against his forearm. His eyes scanned briefly, then settled on Marcus's seat like a hawk choosing its landing. He stepped closer, slowly and purposefully, stopping right beside Marcus's aisle. The movement was unnecessary. There was nothing to check, no passenger needing assistance, no overhead bin ajar. Nestor stood still, fingers tapping slowly at the corner of the screen in his hand, gaze flicking around the cabin as though pretending to assess safety compliance. Then, in a moment that reeked of subtle orchestration, he extended a single finger and pressed the orange service button embedded in the wall panel beside Marcus's seat. It was the security alert, a discreet signal, a code. To the untrained eye, it could have looked like routine equipment check. But Marcus had flown enough, observed enough, endured enough to know exactly what that button meant. It was used for disturbances, for threats, for problematic passengers. And Marcus, quietly sipping water, tablet in hand, had done none of those things. Nestor didn't speak. He didn't ask Marcus a question. He didn't even look at him directly. He simply tapped the screen of his tablet again and moved on, returning down the aisle without so much as a glance backward. Marcus exhaled, slow and deliberate, as the cold weight of implication settled on his chest. He had been labeled, not with words, but with protocol, not with accusation, but with suggestion. That was the tactic. Push the narrative until the system believed it. Across the aisle, the woman with the tortoiseshell glasses looked up again, a faint crease forming between her brows. She had seen the same thing, but her gaze dropped just as quickly, and she returned to her book. That was the other tactic, make it quiet enough so that even witnesses would question what they saw. A few minutes passed, the lights dimmed further for rest mode, and flight attendants began preparing the cabin for long-haul cruising. Marcus remained seated, upright, calm, and alert. He scrolled through his notes for the Zurich presentation he was scheduled to deliver the next morning, one on algorithmic fairness and the dangers of invisible bias in digital systems. Ironic, he thought, as if the world itself had staged this flight as a case study. Karen Delbridge, seemingly asleep in her reclined position, suddenly stirred with dramatic flourish. She sat upright, removed her sleep mask with a groan, and began digging through the designer tote that had earlier replaced Marcus's bag in the overhead bin. Her movements were exaggerated, as if performing for a camera that didn't exist. Then, with a feigned gasp, she yanked a leather folder from her bag, causing a dozen sheets of thick printed paper to spill into Marcus's lap. Charts, memos, and what looked like handwritten notes tumbled onto his legs and down the side of his seat. "Oh my God!" Karen exclaimed, her voice loud enough to startle 2 passengers nearby. "I'm so sorry, it's just so cramped in here." Marcus didn't move for a beat. He looked down at the papers on his lap, then slowly picked them up, neatly stacking them without so much as a crease. He held them out toward Karen with a steady hand. "Here," he said. Karen hesitated, then reached forward and took them with a forced laugh. "You know, maybe if some of us weren't taking up so much space, this wouldn't keep happening." Her voice was coated in sugar, but the acid beneath was unmistakable. Across the aisle, the woman with the glasses paused again, brows now knit in open concern. A man in 3C tilted his head as if piecing something together. But still no one spoke. Marcus leaned back without another word. He didn't ask for help. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. Because the truth was clear, they weren't waiting for him to fight back. They were waiting for him to react. His silence hadn't protected him. It had only sharpened their attacks. As he reviewed his final presentation slides for the Zurich summit, notes carefully curated across weeks of preparation, he instinctively reached for the inner sleeve of his carry-on, where he always kept a printed copy of critical files. His hand touched only fabric. He paused, unzipped the main pouch, and searched again. Nothing. A cold realization settled in. He stood, turned calmly, and walked 5 rows back to the overhead bin where he'd been forced to store his bag earlier. It was gone. Not misplaced. Not buried. Gone. He scanned nearby compartments, even checked with the attendants in the galley, his voice calm but direct. There was a black leather carry-on stored here. Do you know where it went? The male attendant blinked. Let me check, he said, disappearing behind the curtain. Moments later, Serinda reappeared from the service corridor, expression unreadable. Sir, your bag has been moved to underbelly storage, she said. It exceeded allowable weight for overhead bins. Marcus looked her directly in the eyes. That bag has flown in overheads on this aircraft model 50 times, without issue. Who authorized that move? Serinda didn't blink. Cabin safety protocol, she said evenly, then turned and walked away without further explanation. Marcus stood still for a moment, surrounded by other passengers who now openly watched him, a few curious, others indifferent, none willing to interfere. His backup notes, his printed diagrams, the hard copies of confidential talking points, all gone beneath the plane, out of reach for the next 9 hours. When he returned to his seat, Karen was already reclining again, headphones back on, pretending not to notice anything. But the tension was growing too heavy to ignore. Even the ambient calm of first class couldn't conceal the storm being staged in plain sight. Minutes later, Nestor returned. This time, he carried a small cabin intercom unit, the kind usually reserved for crew announcements. Without warning or fanfare, he stepped into the forward galley, pressed the mic button, and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the pressurized silence. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay due to a passenger seating confusion. We appreciate your patience. The announcement took less than 10 seconds, but its echo lasted far longer. Heads turned, passengers glanced around subtly, and more than a few looked straight at Marcus. No one said his name, but they didn't have to. He was the only one who'd been asked to move. The only one who'd been visibly obstructed. The only one whose presence had triggered this slow-motion mutiny. Even the language, seating confusion, had been engineered to seed doubt. The woman with the tortoiseshell glasses shot Marcus a quick glance, this time more direct, but again said nothing. The man across from row 3 leaned into his companion and whispered something that made her frown. Karen leaned toward Marcus, just slightly, and whispered behind a smug smile, "You know, sometimes it's just better to go with the flow. These things don't usually happen unless there's a reason." Marcus said nothing. He no longer needed to. The structure of the game had revealed itself fully. They weren't just trying to make him uncomfortable anymore. They were trying to make him leave, force him to react, justify a more official removal, make it his choice, or make it look like it was. He straightened his posture, placed his tablet face down on his lap, and stared forward with silent resolve. Most passengers adjusted their blankets or reclined their seats, but Marcus leaned forward just slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. He wasn't preparing for rest, he was preparing for record. They had crossed a line, not with policy, not with a raised voice, but with something far more dangerous: narrative control. The so-called passenger seating confusion was the final straw, and Marcus knew from experience that if he didn't control the narrative now, someone else would. As Serinda passed his row again with a tray of mints and eye masks, Marcus casually reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and removed a pen-shaped device, small, discreet, unassuming. He clicked it once. A soft vibration confirmed what he already knew. It was recording. The device began capturing audio in high fidelity, programmed to sync with his phone once the flight reconnected to Wi-Fi. Meanwhile, Marcus laid his phone gently in the empty seat's armrest cup holder, angled upward. The camera app was already open. He adjusted the brightness, turned off notifications, and tapped record. For now, he said nothing. He simply waited. Minutes later, just as dessert was being served, Karen shifted in her seat. She sat upright, removed her headphones, and leaned toward the aisle. Her fingers dipped into the side compartment of her tote bag and emerged with what appeared to be a tightly folded linen napkin. But Marcus's eye caught the gleam of something beneath it. Paper edges, crisp and folded into thirds. A bill, maybe more than one. Surinder returned with a final pass through the cabin, checking on post-dinner requests. As she leaned toward Karen casually extended the napkin-wrapped bundle and pressed it into Surinder's hand in one fluid motion. "Thank you for taking such good care of me," she said softly, with just enough breath to make it clear this wasn't a routine gesture. Surinder paused for half a second, too brief to reject it, too long to pretend it was innocent, then slipped the folded napkin into her uniform pocket without acknowledgement. But Karen wasn't done. Her eyes shifted sideways for a split second, locking directly with Marcus's. There was no apology there, no embarrassment, only the smug confidence of someone who believed the rules did not apply to her, and that the man beside her was just another obstacle to step over. Marcus kept his face still, his eyes forward, and let the camera run. He let it capture every twitch of their faces, every motion of their hands, every unsaid implication between them. As Surinder walked away, Karen reclined again, folding her hands delicately over her lap as if she'd just secured her comfort for the next several hours. But what she hadn't noticed, what none of them had, was that Marcus wasn't the only one watching. From 3 rows behind, a young woman had tracked the entire exchange. She'd been quiet for most of the flight, tucked into the window seat behind Karen, dressed in a gray hoodie and glasses, with a backpack she hadn't let out of her sight. Her name was Rowena Ng, a data analyst from Boston en route to a fintech conference in Geneva. But more relevant at this moment was her side project, documenting and archiving incidents of covert racial bias through wearable tech. When Marcus rose to stretch, an intentional, calculated motion to give the camera a wider angle, Rowena stood up quietly as well. She moved toward the restroom, paused beside Marcus in the aisle, and lowered her voice so only he could hear. "You don't know me," she said, barely above a whisper, "but I've been recording everything since you boarded." Marcus turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I have a pinhole cam stitched into my shoulder strap," she continued, lifting her backpack slightly for emphasis. "You need this footage. I saw what they did. I saw what she paid her to do." Marcus didn't speak, but his eyes locked with hers. The moment didn't need words. Rowena reached into a zip pocket and pulled out a small, black USB drive. "Encrypted, time-stamped, synced to takeoff," she said. "You'll want a verified chain of custody later. I'll testify if needed." She placed the drive into his palm and moved toward the lavatory without looking back. Marcus returned to his seat, slipped the USB into the interior lining of his briefcase, and stopped the recording on his phone. He clicked the pen twice to pause audio capture, then exhaled slowly. With the USB now secured in the lining of his briefcase and the recording saved silently in his encrypted cloud folder, Marcus Thorne sat back in seat 2A not as a man enduring injustice, but as one preparing his counterstrike. The entire flight had been a calculated attempt to erase him, to displace him without confrontation, to reframe his existence as disruptive rather than dignified. But now the dynamic had changed. The evidence was captured. The veil had lifted. The next move belonged to him. As the cabin lights shifted into low night mode and the hum of altitude steadied into white noise, Marcus reached slowly into his blazer's inner pocket and retrieved his phone. No longer a passive observer, he unlocked the device with a fingerprint scan and opened a secure app labeled RT Sharehold. The interface was clean, corporate, and familiar. It was a private investor dashboard for stakeholders in Skylux Holdings. With a few swipes and two-step authentication, Marcus tapped into his shareholder account. where his ownership was clearly displayed in bold figures. 24.9%, a controlling minority when combined with proxy agreements from two partner firms. With one press of a digital button, he selected Initiate Emergency Board Call. A confirmation screen prompted him to verify intent. Are you calling an emergency shareholder meeting under Clause 4.2? He pressed yes. The system queued a chain reaction of encrypted notifications to Skylux's legal counsel, investor relations, and, most significantly, the CEO. Marcus didn't bother waiting for acknowledgement. He was well aware of how fast corporate systems moved when the people at the top felt their power being tested. Minutes passed. In the quiet dark, the only indication of what had been set in motion was the subtle blue glow of Marcus's screen and the tightening in Karen Delbridge's jaw as she scrolled through her own phone, unaware of the storm she had just provoked. 30,000 feet below, in a glass-walled corner office of Skylux's Connecticut headquarters, CEO Malcolm Wexley was reviewing quarterly burn rates when his phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. Then again. One was from legal, one from PR, one from the board chair. And then came the text that made the blood drain from his face. You just ejected your biggest investor and the creator of the system you're about to license. Malcolm read it twice, then a third time. He clicked the link embedded in the message and was directed to a secure video upload. Less than 10 minutes long, high definition, time-stamped, geotagged. The footage began with a shot of a well-dressed black man seated calmly in 2A. The next frames showed Karen slipping money into a flight attendant's hand, followed by audio of the captain approving a security report that cited a non-compliant passenger. There was no shouting, no aggression, just optics. But the optics were enough to get a brand. Malcolm stood quickly, knocking over his tumbler of sparkling water as he fumbled for his jacket. Get me legal. Get me crisis response. Right now, he barked to his assistant, who had already started dialing. On the screen behind him, news alerts began populating the feed. The phrase flight discrimination incident had just appeared as a trending topic. Back in the sky, Marcus's phone vibrated. One by one, responses began arriving. From Skylux board, meeting requested, confirmed. From legal, situation acknowledged, monitoring. From Elise Thompson, Marcus's COO. Do you want me to prep the exit strategy? He replied with a simple directive. Not yet. Let them make the next mistake. In the row beside him, Karen continued to pretend nothing had shifted. Serinda passed by once more with a tray of nightcaps and mints, her expression harder to read now, her movements less confident. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't need to. The gravity had changed. He was no longer the man being pushed. He was the man who had just pulled the ground out from under them. Across the cabin, Rowena caught his eye and gave a subtle nod, understanding that the balance of power had finally tipped. The ripple effect from Marcus Thorne's silent counterattack spread faster than turbulence. Within hours of his emergency board trigger, the once sealed corridors of Skylux Airline's executive wing burst into motion. In offices where champagne flowed more frequently than consequence, panic had begun to bloom. Screens flickered with email threads marked urgent board action required. Phones rang non-stop, voices dropped to whispers, and somewhere near the top floor, a crisis control war room was hastily assembled. But none of that mattered to Serinda, Nestor, or Captain Langdon. At least not yet. For the three of them, the shift came when they were summoned mid-shift, mid-cruise, mid-denial. The tone of the intercom wasn't casual, and the language used, mandatory legal debriefing, immediately upon landing, wasn't normal. The moment they disembarked at Zurich, a suited liaison from corporate security greeted them at the jet bridge with a clipboard, clip tone, and 3 prearranged escort routes. No explanation, no time to ask, only instructions to follow. Within 20 minutes, they were each led into separate conference rooms inside the Skylux International Operations Hub. The walls were stark, the tables metal-framed. The air-conditioned silence broken only by the occasional buzz of a flickering overhead light. Serinda's room was cold and clinical. She took the seat across from a pair of attorneys, one corporate, one independent, and a third man she didn't recognize at first. until he introduced himself. "Jackson Gray," he said calmly, tapping the folder in front of him. "Outside counsel representing Mr. Marcus Thorne." The name hit her like a slap. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Jackson opened the folder, slid a tablet across the table, and pressed play. The screen lit up with high-definition footage, crisp, stabilized, time-stamped. In the first clip, she could be seen taking folded currency from Karen Delbridge and slipping it into her jacket. The second showed her placing the VIP reserve card on Marcus's seat. The third, from a different angle, caught her voice as she falsely cited safety protocol to remove his carry-on. She tried to shift her gaze to look anywhere but at the screen. But Jackson wasn't done. He tapped to the next page in the folder and read aloud. "Internal loyalty system record confirms Marcus Thorne as Platinum Tier Elite. C2A purchased and confirmed 45 days prior. No overbook, no reassignment. Just selective targeting." Serinda's jaw clenched. "I was following orders," she said finally, her voice brittle. "Karen tips well. She's a regular." "You weren't following policy," Jackson replied, folding the tablet shut. "You were following prejudice." 2 rooms down, Nestor sat in silence as a different attorney reviewed passenger complaints logged over the last 12 months, most of them referencing his attitude, his tone, his intimidation-style enforcement, and disproportionately negative interactions with non-white passengers. Then came the footage of him pressing the security button beside Marcus's seat, without cause, without discussion. Was he threatening anyone? The attorney asked. Disruptive? Loud? Nestor said nothing. Did he fail to comply with crew instruction? Silence again. Then why call in security protocol? Nestor exhaled sharply, but it was the kind of breath that carried no defense, only the weight of exposure. Next door, Captain Langdon sat across from Skylux's Director of Legal Affairs and the COO, who had flown in that morning from the U.S. Without notice, they played a 15-second clip, audio of Langdon authorizing Marcus's removal based on Nestor's vague report and Karen's discomfort. No verification, no direct assessment, just blind approval. "Did you speak to the passenger yourself?" they asked. "No." "Did he raise his voice?" "No." "Did you witness any aggression?" No. Langdon's face, once hardened by years of transatlantic authority, now cracked with doubt. "I trusted my crew," he said. "I thought they were acting within guidelines." "They weren't," the COO said flatly. "And neither were you." Within the hour, all 3 were handed formal termination letters, effective immediately, with loss of benefits and severance frozen pending legal review. Corporate security escorted each of them out of the building. But the fallout didn't end there. That afternoon, civil complaints were filed with the Federal Aviation Authority, Equal Opportunity Commission, and a host of international oversight agencies. The charges included racial discrimination, targeted removal, policy manipulation, and coercion under color of authority. Skylux's PR team scrambled to get ahead of the narrative, but the story was already viral. Millions of views, press headlines reading "Investor Ejected from Own Airline," and screenshots of Karen's bribe mid-handoff circulated across social media under trending hashtags like #FirstClassBias and #SkyluxScandal. Inside Marcus's Zurich hotel suite, Elise Thompson, his COO, poured a cup of black coffee as he reviewed legal confirmations from his team. "All 3 terminated," she said. "Initial filings submitted. We have everything we need." Marcus nodded without looking up. "Good. Let them sit with it before we move on to Phase 2. The aftermath of the scandal was swift, brutal, and absolutely public. Within 48 hours of the Zurich incident, Skylux Airlines was no longer just a luxury brand. It was a cautionary tale. Share prices dipped by nearly 20%. News segments ran looping footage of Karen's bribe exchange, and Marcus Thorne's name trended globally as both victim and reformer. But Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. Because for him, justice was never about humiliation. It was about transformation. That's why just days later, he stood at the Skylux global headquarters in front of hundreds of stunned employees as the airline's operations ground to a halt. No flights, no calls, no check-ins. For the first time in the company's 3-decade history, every plane was grounded, not for maintenance, but for moral realignment. In a press conference live-streamed worldwide, Skylux CEO Malcolm Wacth stood beside Marcus, face pale but composed, as he read from a prepared statement. Effective immediately, Skylux Airlines will suspend all commercial operations for a 48-hour mandatory equity and bias training initiative. Every employee, from crew to executive, will complete this program before returning to service. This initiative is not a punishment. It is our new standard. He stepped back, and the cameras turned to Marcus. Clad in a dark suit, his tone calm, Marcus addressed not the cameras, but the room. "This is not just about me," he began. "It's about what happens when culture turns a blind eye to bias, when silence becomes policy and routine becomes injustice. The people who targeted me didn't know who I was. And that's the point. Because if I hadn't been a CEO, if I hadn't been a shareholder, I would have been just another black man removed from a flight for being inconvenient. This system doesn't just need correction. It needs recalibration." That recalibration came in the form of an unprecedented initiative, Elevation Reset. Developed by Marcus's own firm, Right Tech Solutions, the program combined AI-driven bias simulations, live response training, and real-time empathy mapping to confront prejudice not with lectures, but with experiential learning. The sessions were not optional. They were structured, immersive, and deeply personal. In one module, employees were placed in simulated environments where their split-second decisions toward diverse avatars would affect outcomes in visible, measurable ways. In another, they had to review real passenger interaction transcripts, anonymized but authentic, and identify missed moments of respect, dignity, and intervention. For the first time, cabin crews were forced to reckon not just with company rules, but with the human impact of their indifference. And Marcus didn't just watch from afar. He visited training sites. He sat at the back of rooms. He listened as employees broke down in tears, as others argued defensively, and as a few sat in stone-faced silence. Some tried to justify. Others finally understood. And a handful, like Rowena, the passenger who'd handed him the USB, joined the program as facilitators, sharing what it felt like to witness injustice and not speak. But the most surprising announcement came near the end of week 1. In a secondary press event, Marcus revealed that Elevation Reset would include a reintegration track, one designed for former employees who had been terminated due to misconduct, but had expressed remorse and a willingness to change. "Accountability is not vengeance," Marcus told the press. "If we truly believe in equity, we have to believe that growth is possible, even for those who failed. But redemption is earned, not given." The pilot group for that track included 3 familiar names: Serinda, Nestor, and Captain Langdon. All 3 had agreed to undergo the full 8-week rehabilitation program, including entry-level reassignments, monitored mentoring, and public reflection sessions. They started from the bottom: baggage handling, scheduling assistant, policy desk support, and had to work under the very equity protocols they once disregarded. Meanwhile, Skylux transformed. Passenger surveys showed a 15% increase in customer satisfaction. Reports of biased treatment dropped by more than half. For the first time in company history, their service experience ratings were equal across all racial demographics. Hiring practices were revamped. DI roles were elevated to board level. And every onboarding now included a deep dive into what the company called the Zurich Standard. 6 months later, Marcus met again with CEO Malcolm Wacth, not as adversaries, but as partners. In a quiet executive lounge, they reviewed data, listened to staff testimonials, and reflected on the firestorm that forced change. "It nearly broke us," Wacth admitted, "but it rebuilt us too." Marcus nodded. Sometimes growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from confrontation. Then he stood, gathered his briefcase, and headed to Gate A, boarding pass in hand. Seat 2A assigned, no questions asked. The end. If this story moved you or made you think differently about justice and accountability, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the silent discrimination, the turning point, or the final transformation? And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts.